Section 28 of History of Egypt, Volume 1, by Gaston Maspero. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Chapter 3. The Legendary History of Egypt, Part 12. Some of the monuments they have left us seem to show that their reigns were as much devoted to war as those of later pharaohs. The king whose Horus name was Nuremir is seen on a contemporary object which has come down to us, standing before a heap of beheaded foes. The bodies are all stretched out on the ground, each with his head placed neatly between his legs. The king had overcome, apparently in some important engagement, several thousand of his enemies, and was inspecting the execution of their leaders. That the foes with whom these early kings contended were in most cases Egyptian princes of the nomes, is proved by the list of city names which are inscribed on the fragments of other documents of the same nature, and we gather from them that Dobu, Edfu, Hazutonu, Sinopolis, Habanu, Hipponon, Hakau, Memphis, and others were successively taken and dismantled. On this fragment King Den is represented standing over a prostrate chief of the Bedouin, striking him with his mace. Sondi, who is classed in the second dynasty, received a continuous worship towards the end of the third dynasty. But did all those whose names preceded or followed his on the lists really exist as he did? And if they existed, to what extent do the order and the relation assigned to them agree with the actual truth? The different lists do not contain the same names in the same positions; certain pharaohs are added or suppressed without appreciable reason. Where Manetho inscribes Kenkenes and Unephes, the tables of the time of Seti I give us Ati and Ata. Manetho reckons 9 kings to the second dynasty, while they register only 5. The monuments indeed show us that Egypt in the past obeyed princes whom her annalists were unable to classify. For instance, they associate with Sondi a Pirsenu, who is not mentioned in the annals. We must therefore take the record of all this opening period of history for what it is, namely, a system invented at a much later date, by means of various artifices and combinations, to be partially accepted in default of a better, but without according to it that excessive confidence which it has hitherto received. The 2 Thinite dynasties, in direct descent from the first human king Menes, furnish, like this hero himself, only a tissue of romantic tales and miraculous legends in the place of history. A double-headed stork, which had appeared in the first year of Teti, son of Menes, had foreshadowed to Egypt a long prosperity, but a famine under Oeniphes and a terrible plague under Semempses had depopulated the country; the laws had been relaxed, great crimes had been committed, and revolts had broken out. During the reign of Boethos, a gulf had opened near Bubastis, and swallowed up many people; then the Nile had flowed with honey for 15 days in the time of Nephercheres, and Sesostris was supposed to have been a giant in stature. A few details about royal edifices were mixed up with these prodigies. Teti had laid the foundation of the great palace of Memphis; Oeniphes had built the pyramids of Kokeme near Saqqara. Several of the ancient pharaohs had published books on theology, or had written treatises on anatomy and medicine; several had made laws which lasted down to the beginning of the Christian era. One of them was called Kaku, the male of males, or the bull of bulls. They explained his name by the statement that he had concerned himself about the sacred animals; he had proclaimed as gods Hapis of Memphis, Mnevis of Heliopolis, and the goat of Mendes. After him, Binothrus had conferred the right of succession upon all the women of the blood royal. The accession of the third dynasty, a Memphite one according to Manetho, did not at first change the miraculous character of this history. The Libyans had revolted against Necher-Aphes, and the 2 armies were encamped before each other, when one night the disk of the moon became immeasurably enlarged, to the great alarm of the rebels, who recognized in this phenomenon a sign of the anger of heaven, and yielded without fighting. Tosorthros, the successor of Necher-Aphes, brought the hieroglyphs and the art of stone cutting to perfection. He composed, as Teti did, books of medicine, a fact which caused him to be identified with the healing god Imhotpu. The priests related these things seriously, and the Greek writers took them down from their lips with the respect which they offered to everything emanating from the wise men of Egypt. What they related of the human kings was not more detailed, as we see, than their accounts of the gods. Whether the legends dealt with deities or kings, all that we know took its origin, not in popular imagination, but in sacerdotal dogma; they were invented long after the times they dealt with, in the recesses of the temples, with an intention and a method of which we are enabled to detect flagrant instances on the monuments. Towards the middle of the third century before our era, the Greek troops stationed on the southern frontier, in the forts at the first cataract, developed a particular veneration for Isis of Philae. Their devotion spread to the superior officers who came to inspect them, then to the whole population of the Thebaid, and finally reached the court of the Macedonian kings. The latter, carried away by force of example, gave every encouragement to a movement which attracted worshippers to a common sanctuary, and united in one cult the two races over which they ruled. They pulled down the meagre building of the Saite period which had hitherto sufficed for the worship of Isis, constructed at great cost the temple which still remains almost intact, and assigned to it considerable possessions in Nubia, which, in addition to gifts from private individuals, made the goddess the richest landowner in southern Egypt. Khnummu and his two wives, Anukit and Satit, who before Isis had been the undisputed suzerains of the cataract, perceived with jealousy their neighbours' prosperity. The civil wars and invasions of the centuries immediately preceding had ruined their temples, and their poverty contrasted painfully with the riches of the newcomer. The priests resolved to lay this sad state of affairs before King Ptolemy, to represent to him the services which they had rendered and still continued to render to Egypt, and above all to remind him of the generosity of the ancient Pharaohs, whose example, owing to the poverty of the times, the recent Pharaohs had been unable to follow. Doubtless authentic documents were wanting in their archives to support their pretensions; they therefore inscribed upon a rock, in the island of Sahil, a long inscription which they attributed to Zosiri of the third dynasty. This sovereign had left behind him a vague reputation for greatness. As early as the 12th dynasty, Usirtasen III. Had claimed him as his father, his ancestor, and had erected a statue to him. The priests knew that, by invoking him, they had a chance of obtaining a hearing. The inscription which they fabricated, set forth that in the 18th year of Zosiri's reign he had sent to Madir, lord of Elephantine, a message couched in these terms: "I am overcome with sorrow for the throne, and for those who reside in the palace, and my heart is afflicted and suffers greatly because the Nile has not risen in my time, for the space of 8 years. Corn is scarce, there is a lack of herbage, and nothing is left to eat. When any one calls upon his neighbours for help, they take pains not to go. The child weeps, the young man is uneasy, the hearts of the old men are in despair, their limbs are bent." Did the Ptolemies admit the claims which the local priests attempted to deduce from this romantic tale? And did the god regain possession of the domains and dues which they declared had been his right? The stele shows us with what ease the scribes could forge official documents: when the exigencies require, they crouch on the earth, they fold their hands, the courtiers have no further resources, the shops formerly furnished with rich wares are now only filled with air, all that was in them has disappeared. My spirit also, mindful of the beginning of things, seeks to call upon the Saviour who was here where I am, during the centuries of the gods, upon Thot Ibis, that great wise one, upon Imhotpu, son of Ptah of Memphis. Where is the place in which the Nile is born? Who is the god or goddess concealed there? What is his likeness? The lord of Elephantine brought his reply in person. He described to the king, who was evidently ignorant of it, the situation of the island and the rocks of the cataract, the phenomena of the inundation, the gods who presided over it, and who alone could relieve Egypt from her disastrous plight. Zosiri repaired to the temple of the principality and offered the prescribed sacrifices. The god arose, opened his eyes, panted, and cried aloud, "I am Khnummu who created thee," and promised him a speedy return of a high Nile and the cessation of the famine. Pharaoh was touched by the benevolence which his divine father had shown him; he forthwith made a decree by which he ceded to the temple all his rights of suzerainty over the neighbouring nomes within a radius of 20 miles. Henceforward the entire population, tillers and vine dressers, fishermen and hunters, had to yield the tithes of their incomes to the priests; the quarries could not be worked without the consent of Khnummu, and the payment of a suitable indemnity into his coffers; and finally, all metals and precious woods shipped thence for Egypt had to submit to a toll on behalf of the temple. Though the daily life forced the necessity upon them, it teaches us at the same time how that fabulous chronicle was elaborated, whose remains have been preserved for us by classical writers. Every prodigy, every fact related by Manetho, was taken from some document analogous to the supposed inscription of Zosiri. The real history of the early centuries, therefore, eludes our researches, and no contemporary record traces for us those vicissitudes which Egypt passed through before being consolidated into a single kingdom, under the rule of one man. Many names, apparently of powerful and illustrious princes, had survived in the memory of the people; these were collected, classified, and grouped in a regular manner into dynasties, but the people were ignorant of any exact facts connected with the names, and the histories, on their own account, were reduced to collect apocryphal traditions for their sacred archives. The monuments of these remote ages, however, cannot have entirely disappeared: they exist in places where we have not as yet thought of applying the pick, and chance excavations will some day most certainly bring them to light. The few which we do possess barely go back beyond the third dynasty, namely, the hypogeum of Shiri, priest of Sondi and of Pirsinu; possibly the tomb of Khut at Saqqara; the great Sphinx of Gizeh; a short inscription on the rocks of the Wady Maghara, which represents Zosiri, the same king of whom the priests of Khnumù in the Greek period made a precedent; working the turquoise or copper mines of Sinai; and finally the step pyramid where this same Pharaoh rests. It forms a rectangular mass, incorrectly oriented, with a variation from the true north of 4° 35', 393 feet 8 inches long from east to west, and 352 feet deep, with a height of 159 feet 9 inches. It is composed of 6 cubes, with sloping sides, each being about 13 feet less in width than the one below it; that nearest to the ground measures 37 feet 8 inches in height, and the uppermost one 29 feet 9 inches. It was entirely constructed of limestone from the neighbouring mountains. The blocks are small and badly cut, the stone courses being concave to offer a better resistance to downward thrust and to shocks of earthquake. When breaches in the masonry are examined, it can be seen that the external surface of the steps has, as it were, a double stone facing, each facing being carefully dressed. The body of the pyramid is solid, the chambers being cut in the rock beneath. These chambers have been often enlarged, restored, and reworked in the course of centuries, and the passages which connect them form a perfect labyrinth into which it is dangerous to venture without a guide. The columned porch, the galleries and halls, all lead to a sort of enormous shaft, at the bottom of which the architect had contrived a hiding place, destined, no doubt, to contain the more precious objects of the funerary furniture. Until the beginning of this century, the vault had preserved its original lining of glazed pottery. 3/4 of the wall surface were covered with green tiles, oblong and slightly convex on the outer side, but flat on the inner; a square projection pierced with a hole served to fix them at the back in a horizontal line by means of flexible wooden rods. The 3 bands which frame one of the doors are inscribed with the titles of the Pharaohs; the hieroglyphs are raised in either blue, red, green, or yellow, on a fawn coloured ground. Other kings had built temples, palaces, and towns, as, for instance, King Kasakimu, of whose construction some traces exist at Heracleopolis, opposite to El Kab, or King Kasak who preceded by a few years the Pharaohs of the 4th dynasty, but the monuments which they raised to be witnesses of their power or piety to future generations, have, in the course of ages, disappeared under the tramplings and before the triumphal blasts of many invading hosts. The pyramid alone has survived, and the most ancient of the historic monuments of Egypt is a tomb. End of Chapter 3. End of Volume 1 of the History of Egypt, by Gaston Maspero. Read for Professor Heather Mbai in Carrollton, Georgia, in June 2009. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.